Hello again. I'd just like to once again open by saying thank you to my lovely patrons for helping make this video possible, and to say today we'll be doing something a little bit different, because while we are discussing 3 common misconceptions about Tim Drake, I'm also going to be using it as a chance to talk about the nature of fanon and the thought processes that go into comic book writing, at least as I understand them, and the interplay therein. This is partially because Tim is already a very well-known character, and while he has been mismanaged at times, it's not nearly to the extent of some other characters, and also just because that it lines up really well and is very convenient. With that in mind, I'm going to start us off easy by saying Tim is not a coffee addict, or more to the point, that is a very recent addition to his character. The first 20 or so years of comics, as far as I'm aware, Tim had coffee exactly once. It wasn't particularly notable, it was just something happening in the background of a scene, and he never really commented on it. Honestly, his diet, as is befitting of his lifestyle, is actually pretty healthy for the most part. But evidently some people saw something, started Xeroxing it as memes, and nowadays it actually is being worked into various comics to some degree or another. This one by itself is relatively harmless, I just think it's rather noticeable, and it also is useful to compare against a more harmful one, which is Tim is the best at computers. Which you'd probably find odd given Jason mastered computer science in less than 6 months, and Dick was consistently shown to be a brilliant hacker, programmer, etc. throughout his Nightwing run. Unlike the coffee one, which basically came from nowhere, I think this is more reflective of the fact that hacking was becoming more common in parlance around the time Tim was Robin, and as a result we saw him doing it more and it became associated with him, even though all the Robins and a lot of other characters are shown consistently to be really good at this kind of thing, so doing a "this one is better than all the others" doesn't really work. There's a rather amusing Tumblr post floating around somewhere that goes along the lines of "Fanon Tim is just Barbara Gordon as Oracle with depression anxiety grafted on." Which, yeah, is a pretty accurate summation of the situation, because Tim didn't normally have depression and anxiety, or at least he didn't have depression until his entire civilian network and also his best friend and love interest were killed off for drama, in a doomed bid to make him more like Batman. But Barbara Gordon did drink a lot of coffee and was actually the best at computers, so yeah. As noted, the coffee one is relatively harmless. As for the computer one, that is a bit more of a problem, often because of how it ends up sort of undermining or otherwise dismissing other characters' established skill sets. But it was usually kept out of comics thanks to Oracle, but after she was removed, yeah, let's just leave it at that for now and move on to point 2, which has had far more harmful implications on character backstory and just spreading massive misinformation across the fandom. Point 2. Tim did not sneak around Gotham for years on end taking pictures of Batman and Robin. Tim kept up with Batman and Robin through fanish devotion the same way most normal people would. He followed newspaper articles, magazines, that sort of thing, because this was written in the late 80s, early 90s. In the modern day that would likely be translated to following the internet, but the point is, he wasn't running around Gotham. I think this assumption comes from 2 places. One, the terrible Titan Tower fight where Jason is telling Tim his own backstory, but seems to get a lot of facts wrong and is mostly being characterized as an angry man-child, so I certainly just ignore it. And also from A Lonely Place of Dying, where Tim did actually get a picture of Batman, but he was on school holidays, and it mostly seems to have happened by chance, as he assures Dick, as this happened when Bruce was coming apart about Jason's death and very much not functioning well. A lot of fanon has ended up taking this and running with it to the point where they argue that Tim spent weeks at a time wandering around Gotham in the dangerous nights and climbing atop buildings and otherwise putting his life in danger, and no one noticed or cared, which leads into my point 3. There's this very prevalent idea that Janet and Jack Drake were actively abusive towards Tim. This is rooted in the fact that they weren't around very much during his childhood or teenage years because they're often out doing archaeological digs, work, etc. If you take the fanon way this is often read, then they're outright pedophiles sometimes, or pimping Tim out, or physically abusive torturers and otherwise absolute monsters, and yeah, that's just completely baseless. The childhood neglect thing does have more of a basis, but due to the nature of comic book writing, let's see, I told you we'd get back to that, I do have to question the nature of the claim. I'm going to break my point down onto this into 3 sections: in-universe, motivation of the author, and subconscious bias. Subconscious bias is honestly the hardest one to actually guess at, so I'm mostly going to keep that as a short segment to note that while some stories are clearly written to try and convey a certain idea, such as Stephanie is not suited for vigilante life, the story itself ends up making us sympathize with Stephanie rather than with Bruce. The best example of this would be the story I mentioned in the Stephanie Brown video, where Bruce sets up what amounts to a supposed to fail test for Stephanie, where she does all the same things Bruce did, but didn't have contact with a nuclear-sensing superhero who ended up solving the problem for Batman. Thus, despite the stated intent of the story being meant to prove that she wasn't suited for the job, we mostly end up coming out sympathetic towards her and on her side. With that in mind for Janet and Jack Drake, honestly, very rarely does Tim ever indicate that he particularly resents his parents for being absent. It comes up every now and again, but so sporadically across decades of time that it very much doesn't feel like an underlying character motivation or something that the writers otherwise felt very strongly about but weren't able to comment on. So now we move on to point 2, the motivation of the author, i.e. what were they trying to communicate with this story, idea, or scene, as opposed to what was actually conveyed to the audience or in universe. A good example of this outside of Janet and Jack Drake would be how often Bruce ends up hitting his kids, and like realistically, that is horrifying and awful, but very rarely do the comics ever really reflect on or otherwise address this, which I believe is because the writers weren't thinking, this is a father abusing his children. They're thinking, ooh, wouldn't it be dramatic if he was upset about Jason's death, got into an argument with Dick, and then punched him in the face? And then no one brings it up again because it was just meant to be dramatic, or otherwise narratively convenient and just serve the story. Sort of like how in soap operas you'll have someone who goes from being completely normal to borderline a theatrical supervillain for 5 minutes, and then they just go back to normal because the scene is over, or that story arc is finished and everyone needs to get back to days of our lives. With that in mind, the motive behind Janet and Jack Drake being absent in Tim's backstory was not to give him a tragic backstory, but solely so that he would be able to be the normal Robin, even though he was also like super wealthy, while also not having parents get in the way of his vigilante. Because yeah, that was the intent behind Tim. He wasn't a super genius street kid, he wasn't a world famous acrobat, he was just meant to be normal. Relatable to what the writers assumed the main demographic was. But they also didn't want that getting in the way of, you know, all the fun vigilanting, so his parents just aren't really around much because that's easier for them. That way they can swan back into the story whenever they're needed for a bit of drama, a bit of heartfeltness, and then they move on again. Until they were eventually killed off as part of the whole make Tim like Batman thing, which just ended up removing a lot of what made him unique and interesting. So yeah, in terms of your author motivation, I don't think the intent was for them to be negligent or otherwise abusive parents. And now we get to in-universe, where if you take everything as being 100% canon, then yeah, Janet and Jack Drake were an emotionally negligent, and Bruce is a violently abusive and psychologically abusive parent and mentor. And these things really should probably be addressed or otherwise dealt with in-universe, or at least by the writing staff in some way, but that's not really what we're here to discuss, so I generally just sort of adopt a semi-soft canon approach to these kinds of things, where if something wasn't like super integral to like a major overarching storyline or otherwise character motivation, like everything that went down with Stephanie, I tend to just sort of gloss over it because it isn't used to inform the relationships or character interactions within the comics, so there's not much point in focusing on it over much, unless you actually want to explore that in like a fanfic or something. A quicker side note, there's obviously also the fact, what the author or comic artist believes is acceptable, which sort of falls into the subconscious and motive thing. For instance, at different points in time, spanking has been deemed acceptable, while obviously I consider it child abuse, and because it is child abuse. But the writers at the time when they did write Dick being spanked by Bruce obviously did not intend for this to be an example of physical abuse. One thing that I want to make clear is that I'm not trying to downplay these issues. These are very serious subject matters, and I would really like it if the comics actually, tried to address these rather than just writing them off, ignoring them, or otherwise you're making Talia, say, abusive while ignoring what Bruce has done in the past. But the main goal of this was mostly to focus on the nature of canon, fanon, what goes into a story, and why that might create some rather discordant and just sometimes incomprehensible character interactions. So yeah, don't really have much of a bow to put on this one. Thank you for your time, and yeah, if you'd like to help with my work, please consider donating to my Patreon, where you'll see stories, scripts for episodes, and other stuff along those lines. You can also head by my Ko-fi and donate some money, or commission me to do 3D art.